Hello, everyone, and welcome to this pre-recorded session this weekend as part of Arise, a festival of left ideas. Many of you would have joined one of our discussions already, and it's been a great mix of formats, from rallies with dozens of speakers to questions and answers, and now in conversations as well. And this is one of those kind of events today, an in conversation event, in association with two excellent campaigns, Labour for Irish Unity and the Caribbean Labour Solidarity, which is a group that I've worked with on a number of issues for many years and is a real asset to our movement. Our two speakers today will be looking at how the Irish and Black communities here share the experience of being exploited by Britain as a colonial power and within the UK itself. They also share experiences of oppressive policing, miscarriages of justice, and media misrepresentation on a massive scale. This session in conversation between our two guests will explore the connections between the experiences of both these communities and suggest actions that can be taken by the Labour movement to expose and combat present trends which both celebrate and perpetuate myths of Britain's colonial past. So please, if you're watching on YouTube and Facebook during the premiere, do let us know where you're tuning in from and give us your comments. And please do be sure to follow on social media both LFIU and CLS, and also, of course, support Arise Festival. Welcome to Dennot from Caribbean Labour Solidarity, our first speaker. Thank you, Dennot.
Hi, everyone. Hi, Nadine. And Matthew, thank you for this opportunity. I'll be brief. I will look at how, in order to expose and combat the present trends in both that both celebrate and perpetuate the myths of Britain's colonial past, which have led to oppressive policing, miscarriages of justice, and media misrepresentation, I intend to do the following. I'm going to summarize the role of the police as an institution of state. I will examine how this role came about. I will examine the collective mismemory fostered by the state upon the people in this country. I will examine what this mismemory is, how it operates, and why it is perpetuated. And I will close with proposals for remediation. Now, please interrupt me at any time, Nadine, if you wish, if you think there is something to be added. I am Dennot Nyack. I'm an executive member of Caribbean Labour Solidarity, and I've held a number of posts across sectors. Now, if I mention these names to you, some of you may be too young, some of you may not have heard of them, some of you may have heard but didn't understand what they were. The case of David Olawale, 1969. A Nigerian man destitute in this country is believed to have been killed by the police. The Oval 4, 1972, arrested for pickpocketing, exonerated. The Stockwell 6, likewise in 1972. The Confey 3, convicted for the murder of Confey, exonerated. Birmingham 6, 1975. Guildford 4, 1975. The Maguire 7, 1976. The Cardiff 3, 1990. And Child Q, 2020. Now, we've had many examples of what is considered to be not the best behavior on the part of the police. Why has this happened? Is it down to a few rogue police officers, the so-called bad apple that infect the others? Or is there something systemic in how the police as an institution work? Well, it is clear that the police are an institution of state. It's often referred to, they're often referred to as what's called an emanation of the state. They're part of what makes the state what it is. And what is the foundation of the police? Well, if you believe the Police Foundation and the Policy Studies Institute, their definition of the police service in their statement of common purpose remains a helpful one, and it's as follows. The purpose of the police is to uphold the law fairly and firmly, to prevent crime, pursue and bring to justice those who break the law, to keep the Queen's peace, and to help and protect and reassure the community, and be seen to do this with integrity, common sense, and judgment. Well, that's sort of a a 1950s, 1960s version of how the police were viewed. The sort of Dixon of Dock Green approach. For those of you who are too young to remember Dixon of Dock Green, I think it's on YouTube. Go and have a look. The role of the modern police, according to the College of Policing, is that the police are to have operational duties which protect life and property, preserve order, prevent the commission of offences, and bring offenders to justice. They have additional duties, of course. Now, this emanation of the state malarkey, the characteristics of the history of the British state is one of piracy, plunder, kidnapping, theft of land, and theft of labour. It may come as a shock to some people to hear that this is how I describe the British state as it then was, and possibly to some extent as it still now is. But in order to do this, the state had to create a set of ideologies, a series of rules, regulations and laws that supported these endeavors. Dare I say it, even the mafia has to have rules. Now, one of these ideologies was the creation of the concept of race, and with it racism. This was vital if other humans were to be robbed, and it serves to create a feeling in which one race believes itself to be superior to another merely because of a particular characteristic. And this makes the endeavor of kidnapping people, shipping them across the Atlantic, trafficking them to work camps, all the more easy to do. And it creates a series of rules which tells each and every player, each and every actor, what their role is. So it's no surprise that once the kidnapping of Africans was established, Africans to the Americas and Africans from Malagasy to the east, such a set of rules had to be established. And hence in, I think it was 1691, the creation of what's known as the slave codes in Barbados was enacted. And this was to control the kidnapped Africans who were being worked to death on the slave camps across the island. Here is something that I've taken from the New Yorker. The government of slavery was not a rule of law. It was a rule of police. The English colony in Barbados passed this first slave law, revised in, which decreed that Negroes and other slaves were wholly unqualified to be governed by laws. And of course, they couldn't be governed by laws because the laws gave even then the citizens who were not in power certain rights as well as obligations. But they were to be governed by a set of special rules for the good of regulating and ordering them. I won't go into what these rules were. It's on the internet. You can read this. Now, the police, as part of the state, are charged with ensuring that the state's ideology, values, and laws are kept. So, where a state is based on racism, the task of the police is to ensure that racist laws are followed. For example, the Geheimstaatspolizei, the Gestapo to you and me, the secret police of the Nazis in Germany, of Nazi Germany, the South African Police Service and its constables, as part of the apartheid police service of South Africa, is there to enforce the laws that that state believes is necessary for its continuance. Likewise, the use of the watch and the militia in early British policing to ensure that slave laws were followed is not surprising. Hence, the role of policing in British history is entwined with the need to enforce the slave code or its subsequent iterations across the empire. The experience of the police in America is no different, and perhaps is even more illustrating, and that may come out in our discussion subsequently. There is a direct connection between England, Great Britain, and Europe in the history of racism as a justification for the theft of land and people, often referred to as conquest. To our knowledge, the colonization of era during the 12th century by the Cambro-Normans, who owed their allegiances to the British Crown, is probably one of the longest on record. As with the advent of kidnapping, human trafficking, and working to death of Africans, these endeavors were subject to policing by the ruling elements of the state. And this was done through the mechanism of policing the subject people. How did the police come about? Well, this is quite a complex subject, subject that's left perhaps to progressive historians. But we can say that in terms of Britain, what we now recognize as the police was first suggested in some formal way by a guy called Patrick Colquhoun. Patrick Colquhoun tried to get the people of London to bring about a police service, a police force rather, that he had experienced in Ireland. He wasn't successful, but however, he was followed later by Robert Peel, who revivified his efforts and created what we now recognize as the ancestors to the modern police force. Now, I said earlier that the British state was based upon things that they probably don't teach you in the national curriculum. The national curriculum still has to follow a very strict structure as to how it teaches British history. This is part of the fostering of the collective mismemory by the state. What is mismemory? How does it operate and why is it perpetuated? Well, Britain is a capitalist state. Its modus operandi is based upon this theft, kidnapping and exploitation, the theft of land, the theft of resources, and following the First and Second European Wars, we have seen the end of empires as capitalism has morphed into its current form. But it's still based upon the theft of land and the theft of resources. The difference is that it's done in a different way. So, for example, it's through local agents such as Obiang of Equatorial Guinea, whose oil resources have been stolen from his people, but he gets a nice slice of it. Or through direct intervention in things such as Iraq, Libya, Syria, for example. And it's a requirement of capitalism that the population at large is told a coherent story that secures their cooperation. A huge part of this story is mismemory. And such mismemory is based upon racism, which others are exploited and their resources are stolen. Now, an illustration of this is to ask people, what caused the First European War? What was it? What caused the Second European War? What was it? And people will tell you words strung together like a spaghetti soup of ideas such as democracy, freedom, and so on. No, generally it was about a fight between capitalist nations for resources. What is this memory? Well, it's based on racist myths, which are taught subjects. How do you, so you say, why do you say this? Well, in previous incarnations, teaching was done directly through education, contemporary media, and public spectacle. This has to be evolved. So whilst there was changes in formal education, fiercely resisted up to now by education ministers, quite a number of the candidates standing for election to be leader of the Conservative Party and therefore Prime Minister have railed against teaching accurate history. Well, we have all of these contributing to the collective mismemory. What are we going to do about it? What are the actions? Well, I can only give you some of the actions for remediation of this mismemory. Going back to the New Yorker article that I quoted on earlier before, the best people with the best intentions doing their utmost cannot fix the system from within. And this was the author of the article on policing in the New Yorker stating about trying to change the police system in America. Likewise, trying to change the mismemory in Britain cannot be done by good people individually trying to change a little bit here and a little bit there. I agree with the New Yorker. Attempts to change things from inside, in other words, identify and remove bad apples, will not do, whether those bad apples are racism or history being turned on its head. I suggest overall that all progressives remain vigilant to the abuse of history, challenge these abuses, and in so doing, explain to people why the history is incorrect and explain. Don't force, don't hammer. Work should be conducted to decolonize this mismemory and expose the reality of Britain's history of empire. Now, this is not an attack against white people, it's not an attack against people living in Scunthorpe or everyone should feel bad. Britain has a history, part of which is good, but a large part of which is not so good. Let us learn what it is. We're not rewriting history, we're writing history. I also suggest that we must include specific works to give us a clarity of our history. And that work should state directly the need to unlearn racism. And in so doing, we undertake our task through winning of minds, rather than battering people with laws and regulations. Laws and regulations are very important. I practice laws and regulations in one of my jobs in terms of combating racism and other discriminations. Very useful, but we're not going to hammer people. Like the campaign against smoking, we must create an environment in which racism and the framework of racism, whether it's anti-Irish racism or anti-Black racism or anti-Muslim racism, is seen to be anathema, which no right-thinking person should hold or preach or speak or preach. And so with that, I say to Nadine, if you're ready, let us have what you're going to say, and we'll continue from there. Of course, we'll have discussions as we go through.
Thanks very much, Dennot. As Matt said, I'm chair of Labour for Irish Unity, which is a group working the labour movement and the wider movement to support those in Ireland seeking self-determination. I'm also an executive member of Caribbean Labour Solidarity, and Dennot and I talked about the very similar aims of the two organisations in our recognition of the consequence of colonialism and what the state can do to different states abroad. In terms of the link between Irish and Black communities and their experiences of racism and also policing, the predecessor to Labour for Irish Unity, the Labour Committee in Ireland, worked very closely with Black sections in the 1980s, and we learned a lot from working with that group. The Irish community suffers from anti-Irish racism, and I wouldn't say it is of the same level as Black racism, but I recently been reading a very interesting book called Legacy of Violence from an American author at Harvard called Catherine Elkins. And she says that in effect, the Britain racialized the Irish, equating their culture to those of Black and brown people, sometimes using dehumanizing language to describe their physical appearance and living conditions, and believing that the Irish were a backward population that needed to be civilized. That seems to me a very good appreciation of what was done to the Irish community over the years and over the centuries. And there was a very good book produced in the 1980s by Information in Ireland, which brought together various cartoons used about Irish people to denigrate them, their intelligence, and create an impression they were all terrorists. Now, Dennot has looked in particular at the police force, and when you're looking at Northern Ireland, it's a slightly wider group of people who are policing, because in the past 100 years or more, the Irish community that seemed to be difficult, the people pushing for self-determination, the Catholics, the nationalists, have been policed by a number of different people. The Royal Ulster Constabulary, which took over from the RIC, and are now the police service in Northern Ireland. The British Army, when it was in Northern Ireland during the Troubles and afterwards, and the Ulster Defence Regiment, which was actually the largest regiment in Northern Ireland during the so-called Troubles, but it was recruited from people in Northern Ireland, and it tended to find the most recruits from the loyalist areas who were very anti-Catholic and anti-nationalist. So there were a group of people policing, and sometimes that policing was in competition with each other. There were lots of paid perjurers, there were lots of agents, and sometimes the different parts of the British Army, different parts of the intelligence and the police were working against each other. I would agree with Dennot that it's not simply good enough to say there's a few bad apples in these policing forces. In my view, it's more like there's a few good apples in these forces who have stood up for justice and for the right approach to policing. But they have to really fight against the canteen culture surrounding them, the lack of any cultural education. The very young recruits that went to Northern Ireland at the beginning of the 70s had no understanding of Ireland or its history, and were very scared and didn't understand what had happened, which sometimes, but not always, account for their very poor behaviour. And then, of course, it's the British Empire has consistently adopted divide and rule policies and continue to do so in Northern Ireland. I'm going to begin by looking at a very contemporary issue, which is the new Northern Ireland Troubles Legacy and Reconciliation Bill, which is presently in Parliament. Now, the objective of the bill appears on the surface just to be to protect various members of the army who have killed civilians during the so-called Troubles. But actually, it also needs to be seen in the context of the Police Crime and Sentencing and Courts Act, Just for You and Courts Act, and the Bill of Rights Bill. All these bits of legislation seek to protect the executive, to allow it to use the police, what other methods it has, to actually choose who they think has the right and who has not the right to protest, to speak up, or to be heard. So the Legacy Bill is a particular part of that panoply of repressive laws at the moment. And what it seeks to do in a nutshell, it seeks to stop any inquiries, investigations, judicial reviews, or inquests into killings in the 30 years of the so-called Troubles, which involved either members of the armed forces or the paramilitaries who supported them and who they encouraged. And there were a multitude of killings. And the reason why lawyers are so interested in those killings is that Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights not only protects an individual's right to life, but it also imposes procedural obligations on the state, not only to investigate violent deaths, but to prosecute the killers if the death was unlawful. Now, this is the role of an inquest, and it's been the role of inquest for many, many years. Inquests have actually been suspended before in Ireland by the British, but now they're seeking to suspend all inquests and other investigations during the so-called Troubles. Now, they say it's because the inquest system isn't working in Northern Ireland, but there are many reasons why it hasn't worked for the 30 or more years since the 70s, nearly 50 years now. At the beginning, it's because inquests purely didn't happen in any meaningful way during the 70s and 80s. There were very cursory inquests into any killings, and the families were just too cowed by the authorities to protest. It's only really after the Good Friday Agreement that inquests and the call for inquests came about again. And the need for these inquests and new inquests was that in the 70s and 80s, what was then the RUC, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, conspired very clearly on the side of the paramilitaries of a loyalist persuasion and the police and the army. There's much evidence now about them burning getaway cars that were used by loyalist paramilitaries, destroying evidence of interviews, of not really interviewing at all when it was people they knew from school, from the army, from their local football club. And it took a long time for lawyers and judges to begin to be able to tackle that, partly because at the beginning, many of those lawyers and judges came from exactly the same communities, and it was difficult to believe the extent of the mistreatment of suspects, the extent of the failure to police properly. But over time, more radical lawyers and judges rose up the ranks. And as I was saying, Dennot, earlier, it's an unintended consequence of the employment discrimination in Northern Ireland that many nationalists and Catholics were barred from any job in industry, place like Harland and Wolff, in many businesses. And therefore, like the Black communities, they understood the need for further education. And they turned to professions, and many of them turned to the law. Now, so there then became a real clamour, which involved also judicial reviews, appeals to the European Court of Human Justice of Rights to bring these inquests into force. Then the state moved again in the form of the Assembly, which was then loyalist dominated, and they said there was not sufficient money to run these inquests. There then were a few years of a real fight between the judiciary and the state, the executive, to bring these inquests into life. And it was only a few years ago they actually got listed, and they are now moving through the courts. It's these inquests which the government here seeks to bring to a halt. I'll just give two brief examples of the findings. People may well have heard of the Ballymurphy killings in 1971. On the day that internment started, internment with that trial, and for the two following days, a number of different regiments were in the Ballymurphy estate in Belfast. In the end, they killed 11 civilians. One was a priest, reminiscent of Bloody Sunday, holding up a white piece of cloth as he tried to rescue somebody. One was the mother of 6 children who was left to plead to death in a field. Now, Mrs. Justice Keegan, who now is a Chief Justice in Northern Ireland, found that they were all innocent, unarmed citizens, and they'd all been killed. Significance of the Ballymurphy massacre is it wasn't one regiment, there were 3 or 4 different regiments over those 3 days involved in killings. Again, difficult to see one bad apple being an explanation. Another quick example is more recent, just last month. Her Honour Judge Crawford concluded that Kathleen Thompson had been killed again in 1971 in her own garden in Derry. She was shot twice in the chest. Soldier D claimed that he thought there was shooting coming from her garden. The judge did not believe him, said that he was a contrived and self-serving witness. And armed with authorities' reports, ballistic reports, and other witnesses, she found that he had shot at a woman whose only action was to bang a bin lid on her garden path to alert other neighbours the presence of the soldiers. Now, as I said, these inquests, well, the ones that haven't actually got into court so far will be completely stopped by this new bill. Ones that will also be stopped, which I think may be more significant, even than the ones about the soldiers, are the ones which involve collusion. Because as I said before, there's widespread collusion between the army and loyalist groups, both ones which are completely legal, like the Ulster Defence Regiment, and ones which are completely illegal, like the Ulster Volunteer Force. Now, there was one particular gang that it's accepted they killed about 120 civilian Catholics over the 1970s in Mid-Ulster and elsewhere. One of the most well-publicised group of killings was at the Miami show band, the killing of a group of musicians, young musicians, both Catholic and Protestant, as they crossed towards the border. Now I'm just going to, I'm not sure how much time I've got left. I'm just going to go on to one other thing which I think is very important. People here in England are very unlikely to have seen pictures of what happened last week at the July the 12th processions. Every year, thousands and thousands of loyalists commemorate the defeat by King Billy the Protestant, king of Catholic opposition in Derry. The night before the 12th, lots of bonfires are built as part of the celebration. What was noticeable this year was the number. There were 250 bonfires, often of a hugely high height. The police service in Northern Ireland didn't stop any of the bonfires. The only one that didn't go ahead was where one man building a bonfire unfortunately fell to his death. But these are hundreds of feet high and they're very close to housing. The police take no action about them on health and safety grounds. But what was also very notable this year is there are always posters of Sinn Féin and SLP councillors burnt on these bonfires. And they're quite often Irish and Palestinian flags burnt on these bonfires. But this time, for many years, there were also effigies of nationalist politicians. So Mary Lou MacDonald, who's a Sinn Féin leader of opposition in the Parliament, the Dáil in Dublin, her effigy was burnt, as was the effigy of Michelle O'Neill, the first minister designate in the Northern Ireland Assembly, if it were to be able to sit, and also Naomi Long, the leader of the Alliance Party. The shock for me is that none of these pictures appeared in any British newspaper that I could find. It wasn't reported in the radio or TV news, and no member of the government, no member of the Labour Party actually made any condemnation of these events. The police service in Northern Ireland, getting back to policing, had a fairly typically sectarian view of the incidents. They did say they were going to investigate the burning of effigies, but it's notable the language was very different to a statement they put out and was reported by the Irish Times, because at another bonfire in a field near it, some nationalists removed Union Jacks and other, I suppose, loyalist paraphernalia. They didn't burn them, they just took them down. And the PSNI issued a statement saying they believe that this was a hate crime because of the bigoted behaviour of nationalists towards a loyalist culture. I'm going to hand back to Dennot at this point, but I have more things to say about this culture and what we should be doing in the UK about this. Dennot?
Okay, what I think your last part illustrates is that we've had quite a series of iterations of the police service used in Northern Ireland. And some of their worst excesses have been ameliorated, but they've not been ameliorated. And by amelioration, I mean changed in a little way, not changed significantly. And by amelioration, it means that you are still the same, effectively. You haven't changed much. And those bits of amelioration have succeeded changes in the political dynamics. So I think that to change things fundamentally, you have to change the state structure. You have to change it so that it actually reflects perhaps a new reality. Now, do you think that is likely to happen anytime soon? We've had in my lifetime, the Royal Ulster Constabulary, with their auxiliaries, the B Specials. Certainly you've had the Police Service of Northern Ireland, but they also are tainted with certain other things.
Thank you, Dennot. I remain optimistic, but only in the context of the huge progress we're making towards United Ireland. It's my view that the police service in Northern Ireland, despite the attempts of some people, remains a police service for the loyalist community. They are cowered not only by the threatened violence of some elements of the loyalist community. I'm not saying they're all violent. They don't move in to stop riots by young loyalists. They didn't move in to deal with the effigies and posters. Not just because of that, but also because they very much they go to those churches, they attend the same schools. It is very difficult for them to be seen to take a different side. But it's my view that once there is United Ireland, there will be some movement. Sectarianism may remain in pockets, but people will have a shared future and will work towards a shared future. But I am concerned about the role that the present government, or even a future Labour government, will take in preparing for a border poll and change, unless they face up to the colonial nature of Northern Ireland. It's not good enough for the Labour leadership to say they're an honest broker between two warring factions. They need to look at the history of the last 50 years. They need to look at the abuses. They need to look at what's happening now. There is no equivalence. And to say there is equivalence and to fail to recognise the huge advances for women, gay people, marriage rights, the growth of the Alliance Party, the complete different perspectives by many of the young people in Sinn Féin, the huge amount of young women who are active in Sinn Féin, the failure to actually support and celebrate that is holding back any ability to be a positive part of change in Northern Ireland. It's not good enough for the Labour Party to say, we'll wait and see what happens when we're in power. Ireland is moving both north and south of the border, and they can either be part of that progressive move or they can stand back on the side of people who've colonised the country for years.